The cabin was filled with an unsettling silence. The kind of silence that doesn't bring peace, but instead tightens the chest and leaves people holding their breath without realizing it. It wasn't the ordinary hum of a routine flight, nor the subtle murmurs of passengers speaking in hushed tones. This silence was different. It carried weight, it carried uncertainty, and it carried fear. The air itself seemed heavier, as though the oxygen was slowly being sucked away from the cabin. Every face reflected the same concern, wide eyes darting toward the front of the aircraft, where the SEAL captain had just risen with an urgent tone that cut through the stillness. His words weren't those of comfort, nor the usual reassurances you hear when something minor occurs during a flight. No, his voice carried the sharp edge of urgency, a demand that gripped every ear and forced hearts to pound harder. The captain's question hung in the air like a strike of lightning that froze the entire cabin. Was there a combat pilot on board? At first, the passengers weren't sure they had heard correctly. Murmurs rippled through the rows, but the silence quickly returned when the seriousness of the situation began to sink in. People exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of what it meant or why such a call had been made. The realization that something had gone wrong gripped the passengers with a wave of dread. It wasn't turbulence. It wasn't a medical emergency. It was something far greater, something none of them had prepared for when they boarded this flight. Children clung tighter to their parents, and parents instinctively reached for the hands of their loved ones. Flight attendants moved stiffly, their practiced professionalism faltering just slightly in their eyes as they too processed the captain's words. The sound of the engines, once a monotonous background hum, now seemed louder, almost ominous, amplifying the uncertainty that consumed the cabin. And then, as if to heighten the tension, time itself seemed to slow. Seconds stretched like minutes, and still no one moved. No one dared to rise. The silence became unbearable, each second pressing down like a weight on the passengers' shoulders. Questions swirled in every mind. Why did they need a combat pilot? Was the aircraft in danger? Were they under attack? The possibilities were too terrifying to speak aloud, so the silence grew even thicker, heavy with fear and doubt. Eyes turned to the SEAL captain, who stood firm, his composure unshaken even as the cabin brimmed with panic. His steady gaze moved across the rows, almost as if daring someone to respond, as if the answer to his call was hidden somewhere among the passengers. The tension was so dense that even the smallest sounds seemed amplified. The creak of a seat shifting, the cough of a nervous traveler, the faint click of someone's watch. Each sound seemed like a disruption in the suffocating stillness, only to be swallowed back into the silence. The weight of the moment pressed down on everyone, and the atmosphere transformed the cramped aircraft into a stage of anticipation, where every passenger was both an actor and an audience, waiting to see what would happen next. People leaned closer to one another, whispering in disbelief, but their whispers added nothing to the situation, only filling the air with fragments of fear. Some shook their heads, some closed their eyes as though refusing to confront reality, and some stared ahead, frozen. And yet, despite the quiet chaos swirling inside every mind, nobody dared to stand. The thought of being the one to step forward felt too immense, too terrifying. The silence after the SEAL captain's question was more than just the absence of sound. It was the absence of action, the paralysis of fear that had gripped the entire cabin. And in that silence, every second became sharper, every heartbeat louder, every eye searching desperately for an answer that didn't seem to exist. The urgency of the captain's call had transformed the cabin from a place of routine travel into a crucible of suspense, where the fate of everyone on board seemed to teeter on the edge of uncertainty, and the silence grew heavier with every breath, demanding a response that no one seemed brave enough to give. When she rose from her seat, the entire cabin seemed to shift as though the very air inside the aircraft had changed. It wasn't dramatic at first. There was no sudden noise or announcement, no clash of movement. It was subtle, a single figure pushing back from the chair and stepping into the narrow aisle. But the act alone broke the spell of silence that had gripped the passengers. Every eye turned toward her, confusion flickering first, then disbelief. She didn't hesitate, didn't falter, and that composure set her apart instantly. In a sea of anxious faces, She looked different, as though she carried with her a strength none of the others could muster. Her movement was quiet, but in the stillness of the cabin, it sounded loud. The shuffle of her shoes against the carpeted floor seemed to echo in the minds of those watching. People leaned forward in their seats, craning their necks to see this unexpected volunteer. The rows parted not with words but with stunned silence, as though they instinctively knew that what she was about to do would change everything. The tension that had been suffocating moments ago now began to ripple into something else, something resembling cautious hope, though no one dared to voice it. The SEAL captain, standing at the front of the cabin with his commanding presence, locked eyes on her the moment she rose. His jaw tightened, not out of doubt but recognition of the gravity of her gesture. In that instant, she wasn't just another passenger. She had answered a call that no one else dared to. The quiet authority in her step, the calm determination in her face, carried more weight than any words could have. She wasn't walking fast, but every step forward seemed deliberate, purposeful, like a soldier walking into battle rather than a civilian on a flight. Passengers whispered among themselves, disbelief threading their voices. Some questioned her ability, their doubt written plainly on their faces. She didn't look like the image most carried of a combat pilot. She wasn't in uniform, she wasn't displaying medals, and she hadn't announced her background in bold declarations. To them, she was just a woman traveling like everyone else, another face in the crowd. But as she moved down the aisle, those doubts collided with the undeniable presence she carried. She didn't waver under their stares, didn't bow under their murmurs. Instead, she walked forward with the steadiness of someone who had faced greater storms than whispers. The cabin itself seemed to draw in around her, the overhead lights humming faintly, the rows of seats creating a narrow corridor that now felt like a stage. Every pair of eyes followed her movement, from the elderly man clutching his armrest to the mother holding her child tighter, to the businessmen who tried to mask their fear with skepticism. Even the flight attendants, trained to maintain composure, couldn't hide the flicker of surprise as they stepped back to give her space. It was as though everyone was waiting for proof. Proof that she was the answer to the captain's plea, proof that her presence meant salvation. The sound of her breathing seemed steady, even measured, but inside, there was fire. Rising from her seat had not been a choice made in hesitation but one of instinct. She knew the risk, she knew the eyes on her, and she knew the weight of expectation pressing down as she walked. But fear had no place in her steps. It had been replaced long ago by training, by discipline, by the ingrained ability to move forward even when the odds stacked themselves high against her. Every second of her movement forward stretched, magnified by the intensity of the moment. She wasn't rushing, but she wasn't dragging her steps either. She moved with the pace of someone who knew the importance of what she was about to do, but also carried the confidence that it was within her power. When she stopped just a few rows from the front, the whispers had died down, replaced by silence again. But this time, it wasn't silence filled with fear. It was silence filled with anticipation. The cabin had changed, and all because she had dared to stand when no one else could. As she stood in the aisle, the murmurs around her grew louder, blending into a low hum of doubt, disbelief, and whispered speculation. People were not ready to accept what they were seeing. To them, she was just another passenger, someone who had boarded quietly, blending into the background like so many others. Now, suddenly, she was stepping forward in response to a call meant for someone extraordinary. A combat pilot. The image didn't fit in their minds, and their reactions betrayed that conflict. Some passengers leaned toward each other, exchanging hushed questions about whether she was serious. Others shook their heads, convinced she was making a mistake or trying to prove something she couldn't possibly back up. The skepticism in the air was almost as thick as the fear. A middle-aged man in a business suit muttered under his breath, just loud enough for the row around him to hear. "She doesn't look like a pilot, let alone a combat one." A young woman pulled out her phone as if documenting the moment would make it easier to believe later. Even the children sensed the tension, asking their parents in small, confused voices why everyone was staring at the woman in the aisle. The doubts weren't shouted, but they were palpable, carried in every sideways glance and every raised eyebrow. Despite the questions and doubts pressing in from every direction, she remained unshaken. Her posture was straight, her expression calm, but her eyes carried a spark that was impossible to ignore. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't showmanship. It was the kind of quiet confidence born from experience, the kind that needed no validation from whispers or speculation. She had heard doubts like these before, had faced the skepticism of those who underestimated her, and she knew how to walk through it without losing focus. Still, the tension between her presence and the passengers' disbelief filled the cabin with a strange electricity. Some passengers wanted to believe in her, wanted her to be exactly what the SEAL captain's question had called for, but they hesitated, afraid of false hope. Others clung to their doubt because it seemed safer, because expecting nothing meant they couldn't be disappointed. The air was thick with this invisible push and pull, a strange battle of faith versus skepticism being fought in whispers and stares. She could hear fragments of their murmurs as she passed. What if she's just pretending? No way she's qualified. It's dangerous. What if she makes it worse? Their words carried the sharp sting of underestimation, but she walked forward without acknowledging them. To respond would only give their doubts power, and she had learned long ago that the best response was action, not words. Let them talk, let them whisper. The truth of who she was would speak louder than anything she could say. The SEAL captain at the front didn't share the same skepticism. His eyes, sharp and calculating, studied her as she approached. Where others saw an ordinary woman, he looked for the details most would overlook, the steadiness of her steps, the way her eyes never darted nervously around the cabin, the quiet control in her body language. He recognized the signs not of bravado but of discipline, the kind of composure honed through years of training and tested under pressure. Where the passengers doubted, he saw possibility. The cabin, however, wasn't ready to follow his lead. The whispers had become an undercurrent, a chorus of disbelief that followed her with every step. Yet there was also a growing tension in their voices, an unwillingness to admit that deep down, they wanted her to be exactly what she claimed to be. They wanted her to be the answer to the captain's call, the one who could take control in the face of crisis. But wanting and believing were two very different things, and for now, most were stuck in between. Her presence forced them to confront something uncomfortable, the possibility that their assumptions about strength, about ability, about who could step into the role of a hero might be wrong. The doubts in their voices weren't just about her qualifications. They were about the limits they had placed in their own minds. She was defying those limits simply by standing there, by walking forward without hesitation, and that alone unsettled them. So the whispers continued, soft but insistent, echoing through the cabin like a test she had to endure before she could prove herself. The atmosphere grew heavier with every word spoken in doubt, and yet, with every step she took, the weight of those doubts seemed to shift, as if she were quietly turning their skepticism into anticipation, transforming disbelief into something they weren't quite ready to name, hope. The SEAL captain stood at the front of the cabin like a pillar of calm amidst the storm of uncertainty, his sharp gaze fixed on her as she moved closer. His face betrayed little, but his eyes carried the weight of experience, the kind that could cut through fear and hesitation with a single look. Unlike the passengers who whispered and doubted, he did not see just another traveler responding to his call. He studied her the way a soldier studies the battlefield, looking not at appearances but at signs, the steady rhythm of her breath, the unwavering line of her posture, the way she carried herself with quiet control. These were details most people missed, but to him they were unmistakable markers. He had seen this before, in the faces of those who had stood shoulder to shoulder with him in combat. For a moment, time seemed to hang between them, a silent exchange of recognition passing without a word spoken. The captain's jaw tightened, his expression still unreadable to the passengers, but his mind was already racing. He didn't need grand declarations or explanations. The calm confidence she projected was enough to tell him she wasn't standing by accident. He could see that her presence wasn't born out of impulse or misplaced bravery but something deeper, something drilled into her over years of training and forged under pressure. Around them, the cabin buzzed with low murmurs, the disbelief of passengers clashing with the silent confidence of the woman standing in the aisle. But the SEAL captain didn't let his attention waver. He had been in enough crises to know when someone carried the ability to step up. His experience told him that true strength rarely needed to shout. It revealed itself in stillness, in how someone held themselves when the world seemed to tilt toward chaos. And here, in the narrow confines of a commercial aircraft, he recognized that same kind of presence. When she finally came close enough, their eyes locked. It wasn't the kind of glance exchanged between strangers on a plane. It was sharper, heavier, like an unspoken test of resolve. He didn't need to ask her questions in that moment, and she didn't need to explain herself. Everything he needed to know was already written in her stance, her control, and the unwavering fire in her eyes. For him, it was the same look he had seen in pilots stepping into cockpits under fire, soldiers walking into hostile zones, and leaders who knew the weight of responsibility but bore it without flinching. The captain's reaction was subtle, but the passengers noticed it nonetheless. They saw the way his posture shifted just slightly, the faint nod of acknowledgement that passed between them, and it sent ripples through the cabin. If the SEAL captain, the man who had stood tall and commanded authority since the crisis began, was willing to give her that acknowledgement, then maybe she wasn't just another passenger after all. The whispers didn't stop, but they changed in tone. Doubt began to mix with curiosity, disbelief giving way to reluctant wonder. For him, this wasn't about appearances or breaking stereotypes. It wasn't about who she seemed to be, but about what she carried with her. He could see the invisible weight she bore, the kind only those who had faced danger before carried with them. He recognized the difference between reckless courage and disciplined composure, and in her, he saw the latter. That recognition wasn't given lightly. It was earned, often in places where hesitation meant lives were lost. The silence between them, heavy as it was, began to shift the atmosphere in the cabin. Passengers felt it too, though they couldn't explain it. They saw something in the captain's eyes that hadn't been there before. An acceptance, almost a quiet trust, and it unnerved them. They wanted answers, wanted proof, but what they were witnessing was stronger than words. It was the unspoken understanding between two people who knew what it meant to face the impossible and still step forward. The captain's presence was steady, unyielding, but now it was matched by hers. Together, they created a different kind of silence than the one that had suffocated the cabin earlier. This silence wasn't filled with fear but with tension of another kind. An expectation that something was about to happen, that a shift was taking place right before their eyes. And though the passengers still clung to uncertainty, the SEAL captain's reaction had planted a seed in their minds, one that would only grow stronger as the truth began to reveal itself. The tension in the air thickened as the moment stretched. Every eye in the cabin locked on her while the SEAL captain held his ground, studying her with the precision of someone who had been trained to see through facades. Yet what followed wasn't just about recognition. It was about the reaction of the people surrounding them. The passengers, crammed into their seats with fear pressing down like a physical weight, couldn't contain their disbelief. To them, the very idea that this woman could be the answer to the captain's call was almost unthinkable. Whispers turned into sharp murmurs, disbelief mixing with the tremors of panic, each voice feeding the atmosphere of doubt that clung to the cabin walls. A man near the back shook his head, muttering that this was no time for games, that they needed a real pilot, someone qualified, someone who fit the mold of what they expected a combat-trained savior to look like. Another passenger scoffed loudly, his voice carrying above the hum of engines, declaring that this wasn't a movie and that risking lives on misplaced trust was madness. The murmurs grew into a low wave of resistance, a collective pushback against the possibility that she could be the one to step into a role so dangerous, so defining. But amidst the noise, there were cracks forming in the wall of disbelief. A woman clutching her child to her chest stared at her with wide eyes, searching not for explanations but for hope, for something to cling to in the midst of chaos. An older man sitting by the window leaned forward, his expression torn between doubt and the faint recognition of something deeper in the way she carried herself. The passengers weren't united in their reactions. Fear fractured them, dividing them into skeptics, cynics, and the faintly hopeful who desperately wanted to believe she might be what she appeared to be. Every shift in the cabin added to the weight pressing down on her, but she didn't falter. She didn't react to the cutting remarks, the scoffs, or the audible sighs of disbelief. Instead, she stood steady, her silence louder than any retort she could have given. That silence became its own kind of defiance, a refusal to be diminished by the expectations of those who couldn't see past the surface. She didn't need to justify herself to the doubters, and that quiet strength unsettled them more than if she had lashed out or tried to defend her right to stand there. The SEAL captain, watching this unfold, did not intervene. He let the passengers' voices rise and fall, let the cabin expose its fear and prejudice, because he knew what they did not, that no amount of debate would change what was about to happen. He recognized that her strength wasn't in proving anything to the passengers. It was in holding her ground when surrounded by doubt. That alone revealed more about her than words ever could. And so the murmurs continued, the cabin alive with disbelief, but beneath it all was something shifting. The more they questioned her, the more her composure seemed out of place, almost unnatural for someone supposedly unqualified. Ordinary people flinched under scrutiny, cracked under doubt, but she remained still, her eyes steady, her breathing calm. Some passengers began to notice that incongruity, even if they couldn't admit it aloud. If she wasn't what they thought she was, then why didn't she break? Why didn't she show fear like the rest of them? It was in these subtle moments that doubt turned inward. Those who had scoffed the loudest began to grow quieter, their certainty eroded by the strength she projected. The disbelief that had bound the cabin together started to fray, leaving small gaps where the possibility of something greater began to slip through. Fear still ruled the space, but it no longer had the same unchallenged hold. Her silence, her composure, her refusal to yield to the weight of the passengers' doubt created a kind of fracture in the narrative they had built for themselves, that only a certain kind of person could rise in a moment like this. The resistance hadn't vanished, but it was no longer the only voice in the room. Alongside it now was hesitation, curiosity, and for some, the faint flicker of belief that maybe, just maybe, the woman standing before them wasn't ordinary at all. The silence after the murmurs faded carried its own kind of weight, pressing down on every soul in the cabin as if the plane itself held its breath. The SEAL captain's question still lingered in the air, not fully answered, yet not dismissed either. The woman standing there had already defied the expectations of everyone around her simply by refusing to shrink back into her seat. But the true test was only beginning. The passengers, though quieter now, still stared with eyes filled with questions, suspicion, and the remnants of doubt. It was in this stillness that the captain finally stepped forward, his voice steady, calm, but edged with the authority of someone who had led others through fire and chaos. His words weren't for the passengers but for her, as if the two of them were locked in a moment that excluded everyone else. He asked her a question not about credentials, not about who she was on paper, but something deeper, something only someone with real combat experience could answer. The words cut through the air with precision, forcing her to reveal in action, not declaration, the truth of her training. Her reply didn't come instantly. She paused, not out of hesitation but because she knew that every word carried weight. Every syllable would either cement the doubt around her or shatter it completely. When she spoke, her voice was low but unwavering, shaped not by the need to convince but by the calm confidence of someone who had faced fire before. Her answer wasn't theatrical. It didn't try to dazzle or impress. It was precise, technical, delivered with the clarity of someone who didn't need to embellish because the truth was strong enough on its own. The captain's eyes narrowed as he listened, not out of suspicion but recognition. He understood what the others couldn't, the cadence of someone speaking from lived experience, the subtle marks of training etched into the way she carried herself, the knowledge that couldn't be faked by someone who had merely read about combat or studied from the outside. The passengers didn't grasp the technical weight of her words, but they felt something shift in the air. Her confidence didn't waver, and the authority in her tone seeped into the cabin like a current, washing away some of the uncertainty that had clung to the walls. The skeptical man in the back who had scoffed earlier shifted uncomfortably in his seat, realizing that her response was not the flimsy claim of someone out of their depth, but the grounded assertion of someone who knew exactly what was at stake. The captain didn't smile, didn't nod, but something in his posture softened, a subtle acknowledgement that the exchange had confirmed what he already suspected. His silence was louder than approval, and the passengers, watching closely, picked up on it. They saw in his restraint the respect he extended only to equals, and that spoke volumes more than any public declaration could have. Her composure in that moment wasn't just about convincing the captain. It was about controlling the room. The passengers, desperate for leadership, had turned their focus entirely on her. Every move she made, every breath, every inflection in her voice became magnified under the collective gaze of frightened eyes. She didn't flinch. She didn't shrink. Instead, she allowed the weight of their expectations to settle on her shoulders as if she had carried it before, as if this wasn't the first time she'd been forced to prove herself when others doubted her. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the energy in the cabin began to shift. The same voices that had resisted her, that had questioned her right to stand, grew quieter still. Doubt gave way to silence, silence gave way to hesitation, and hesitation became the first step toward acceptance. The passengers didn't erupt in applause or vocal support, but the subtle change in their posture, the way shoulders relaxed, the way nervous glances steadied, revealed that they were beginning to place their fragile hope in her presence. The transformation wasn't complete, but it had begun. The SEAL captain's test had drawn out the truth that only he seemed prepared to recognize, and now that truth hovered in the air for all to feel, even if they couldn't yet name it. What had started as disbelief was now bending into reluctant trust, not because she demanded it, but because she earned it in the quiet, unshakable way that only someone forged in fire could.